All right, everybody, welcome back to the Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens, and this is the San Francisco Dharma Collective. And tonight, we're going to dive deep into another sutra. We're still making our way through the Majjhima Nikāya, the middle-length discourses. Tonight, we're going to be discussing, actually, we're going to be kind of just reading in a way, Sutta number 75, the Māgaṇḍiya Sutta. So the teaching given to the wanderer Māgaṇḍiya. We've been making our way through a little section of these suttas, and it's a little grouping of 10 suttas, and they're all teachings that the Buddha is giving to these wanderers. So sort of like, religious people in that way, seekers, we might call them, but not Buddhist. But it's actually what makes this little grouping of suttas really interesting is that it's not the Buddha teaching to the already converted, right? Normally, the Buddha is usually talking to the practitioners, the bhikshus, the bhikshunis, and all of that. But I like this little grouping of suttas because the Buddha's talking to non-Buddhists. So it's all being put in a very kind of clear, instructive way. And for me personally, this sutta tonight is one of the clearest presentations of the Dharma. I'm really excited to share this with everybody. It kind of, for me, is like perfect in a lot of ways. And what I mean by that is all three jewels are fully represented. So the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, like what are those? What do they really mean? Like, what is an enlightened being or a Buddha? What is the teaching? Like, what actually is the Dharma? And what actually constitutes the Sangha? Well, this sutra tonight is, again, for me, one of the clearest presentations. It's a little long. I'm not worried about that, though, because it's so interesting. But it just means we're going to dive right in. It is my hope that we'll get all the way through it tonight. So kick back, relax. It's also a very meditative sutra in that way. In many ways, I feel like I only have one word that I want to kind of explain. It's going to come up right away. But other than that, this sutra just sort of says it. It just says it. So I'm excited to be the one, to be reading it in that way. But let's go ahead and dive in. Again, this is Sutta number 75 to Māgaṇḍiya, the wanderer. Let's dive in. Thus have I heard, on one occasion, the Blessed One was living in the Kuru country, so up north, sort of like sort of moving towards Nepal, like northern India, where there was a town of the Kurus, which is a group of people, the Kurus, and that town was named Kamasadama. On a spread of grass, so the Buddha was staying in that town, and he was staying on a spread of grass in the fire chamber of a Brahmin belonging to the Bhadravajja clan. So that's where we are. Then, when it was morning, the Blessed One, the Buddha, dressed and taking his bowl and outer robe, he went into the city of Kamasadama for alms. When he'd wandered for alms in Kamasadama and had returned from his alms round after his meal, he went to a certain grove for the day's abiding. Having entered the grove, he sat down at the root of a tree for the day's abiding. Then the wanderer Māgaṇḍiya, while walking and wandering for exercise, went to the fire chamber of the Brahmin belonging to the Bharadvaja clan. There, he saw a spread of grass prepared, and he asked the Brahmin, For whom, for whom has this spread of grass been prepared in Master Bharadvaja's fire chamber? It seems like it might be a recluse's bed. Master Māgaṇḍiya, there is the recluse Gotama, the son of the Sakyans, who went forth from the Sakyan clan. Now, a good report of Master Gotama has been spread to this effect. That blessed one is accomplished, fully enlightened, perfect in true knowledge and conduct, sublime, knower of worlds, incomparable leader of persons to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, enlightened blessed one. This bed has been prepared for that Master Gotama. And then Māgaṇḍiya says, Indeed, Master Bharadvaja, it is an ill sight we see when we see the bed of that destroyer of growth, Master Gotama. Now that's the word I just need to clarify. It's this bahunahuno. A bahunahuno is a destroyer of growth. And it's what this wanderer Māgaṇḍiya says about the Buddha, that he's like, ooh, I don't want to see that guy's bed. That guy's a bahunahuno, a destroyer of life or a destroyer of growth. Allow me to very quickly explain Māgaṇḍiya's position here. So like I said, Māgaṇḍiya is not a Buddhist. He's a religious seeker of a different kind. And from the commentary tradition, we know what that word bahunahuno means and like why he's calling the Buddha that. So really quickly, if you were to read anything about this sutra, it describes Māgaṇḍiya as a hedonist. You know, it's just about satisfying sensual pleasures, seeing good things, eating good things, feeling good things. It's like that would be a hedonist, maximizing sensual pleasure. What we know of Māgaṇḍiya is that he was someone who is interested in maximizing sensual pleasure, but it's actually a little more interesting than just being a hedonist. The philosophy apparently of Māgaṇḍiya was one about, like, let's just take a flower, a rose by any other name, they say, right? But let's take like a rose, a beautiful rose flower. The idea is that if I showed you like a beautiful red rose and you were like, ooh, beautiful. And then I showed you another red rose, your mind might be like, you got any other flowers? Like I've already seen the red rose. Well, Māgaṇḍiya would say, ah, but you haven't seen this red rose. And so Māgaṇḍiya supposedly, like, he was a subscriber, so because he wasn't a teacher, but he was a subscriber to the idea that we could maximize sensual pleasure if we didn't bring our past conditioning and our past opinions to the present. And so, in other words, we are missing so much sensual pleasure because we're just putting it into the box of the familiar. That's a slightly different take on hedonism in that way. Now, the Buddha's still going to kind of, go, have a nice discussion with this guy. But I just want you to know that his position's sort of interesting in that way. It's a little more thought out than just have a good time. Now, because of that, Māgaṇḍiya thinks that the whole Buddhist thing, like what the Buddha is teaching, he thinks it's a destroyer or a destroyer of growth or a wrecker of Baha, of like life, of being. So Bahunahuno is this destroyer of Bahu, of life in that way. Now, for me, if you wanted to like the way that I interpret it is he's basically calling the Buddha a buzzkill. Like, that guy's a downer. That guy's a buzzkill. Like, he just wants us to be all like not having a good time. That's Māgaṇḍiya's position regarding the Buddha, is that he's a buzzkill in that way. So that's the idea here when he sees, oh, that's Gautama's bed. That guy's a buzzkill. Now, in response to that, Bharadvaja, the Brahmin, he says, ooh, be careful what you say, Māgaṇḍiya. Be careful what you say. Many learned nobles, many learned Brahmins, learned householders, and learned recluses, they have the fullest, utmost confidence in Master Gautama. And they've been disciplined by him in the noble true path, or the noble true way, in the Dharma that is wholesome. Māgaṇḍiya says, Master Bharadvaja, even if we saw that Master Gautama face to face, we would tell him to his face, the recluse Gautama is a destroyer of growth. And why is that? Because that's what's come down to us in the sutras, in our discourse. Bharadvaja says, well, if Master Māgaṇḍiya has no objection, might I tell Master Gautama this? Psh, let Master Bharadvaja be at ease. Tell him just what I've said. Now, none of that was necessary, of course, because all the while this was going on, with the divine ear, which is purified and surpasses the human ear, the Blessed One, the Buddha, heard this conversation between the Brahmin of the Bharadvaja clan and the wanderer Māgaṇḍiya. Then, when it was evening, the Blessed One rose from meditation, went to the Brahmin's fire chamber, and sat down on the spread of grass made ready. Then the Brahmin of the Bharadvaja clan went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he sat down at one side. The Blessed One, the Buddha, asked him, Bharadvaja, did you have any conversation with the wanderer Māgaṇḍiya about this very same spread of grass here? When this was said, the Brahmin, awestruck, and with his hair standing on end, he replied, we wanted to tell Master Gautama about that very thing, but Master Gautama has anticipated us. But this discussion between the Blessed One and the Brahmin of the Bharadvaja clan was left unfinished. For then the wanderer Māgaṇḍiya, while walking and wandering for exercise, came to the Brahmin's fire chamber and went up to the Blessed One. He exchanged greetings with the Blessed One, and when this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he sat down at one side. The Buddha, the Blessed One, then just said to him directly, Māgaṇḍiya, the eyes delight in visible forms. They take delight in visible forms. They rejoice in visible forms. That has been tamed by the Tathagata, guarded, protected, and restrained. And the Tathagata teaches the Dharma for its restraint. Was it with reference to that, or with this, that you said The recluse Gautama is a destroyer of growth? Yeah, it was with reference to this, Master Gautama, that I said the recluse Gautama is a destroyer of growth. And why is that? Because that is what's recorded in our sutras. And then the Buddha goes on to say, the ear delights in sounds, the nose delights in smells or scents or odors, the tongue delights in flavors, and the body delights in tangibles. The mind delights in mind objects, takes delight in mind objects, rejoices in mind objects. But all that with the ears and the nose and the tongue and the body and the brain, all of that has been tamed by the Tathagata, guarded, protected, and restrained. And he teaches the Dharma for its restraint. Was it with reference to this that you said the recluse Gautama is a buzzkill and a destroyer of growth? Yeah, he said. It was with reference to all of that, Master Gautama, that I said the recluse Gautama is a destroyer of growth. And why is that? Because that's what's come down to us in the sutras. Okay, the Buddha says, tell me what you think, Māgaṇḍiya. Let's just say there was someone who might have formerly enjoyed themselves with visible forms cognizable by the eye, which are wished for, desired, agreeable and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of raga, stimulation or attraction or even lust in that way. But let's say, Māgaṇḍiya, that on a later occasion, having understood as they actually are the origin, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of visible forms. And one might abandon craving visible forms. They might remove the fever for visible forms. And they might abide without tanha, without a thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. What would you say to that person, Māgaṇḍiya? And Māgaṇḍiya says, nothing. I wouldn't say anything to that person. And then the Buddha repeats it and says, okay, well, what do you think? Let's say there was somebody who might have formerly enjoyed sounds cognizable by the ears, odors cognizable by the nose, flavors cognizable by the tongue, and tangibles cognizable by the body that are wished for, desired, agreeable, and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of stimulation and attraction. But on a later occasion, having understood as they actually are the origin, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of tangibles and sounds and all the rest. And let's say that person were to abide without thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. What would you say to them, Māgaṇḍiya? And Māgaṇḍiya replies, nothing, Master Gautama. And now the Buddha tells him, Māgaṇḍiya, formerly, when I lived in the home life, I enjoyed myself. I was provided and endowed with the 5 chords of sensual pleasure, with forms cognizable by the eye, sounds, odors, flavors, and tangibles cognizable by the body, which are wished for, desired, agreeable, and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of attraction or lust. At that time, I had three palaces, one for the rainy season, one for the winter, and one for the hot summer season. I lived in the rain's palace for the 4 months of the rainy season, enjoying myself with musicians, none of whom, by the way, were men, and I did not go down into any of the lower palaces. But then, on a later occasion, having understood as they actually are the origin, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of sensual pleasures, I abandoned craving for sensual pleasures. I removed that fever for sensual pleasures, and I abide without thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. I see other beings who are not free from their craving and lust for sensual pleasures. I see them being devoured by cravings for sensual pleasures. I see them burning with a fever for sensual pleasures, indulging in sensual pleasures. And you know what? I do not envy them, nor do I delight therein. And why is that? Because there is, Māgaṇḍiya, a delight apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, which surpasses even divine bliss. Since I take delight in that, I do not envy what is inferior, nor do I delight therein. All right, so that's sort of like the first movement of the sutra, and that sort of is establishing that's the Buddha's position there. There's quite a bit more to go, but I just want to kind of pause for a moment. So this I feel like is a kind of a Dharma teaching that I feel like I'm always giving. And it's the Dharma teaching that for me has become like condensed into the saying, the Buddha wants us to be having a much better time than we are having presently. And what I mean by that is that the Buddha is not a buzzkill. And so my point is that this idea that I feel like Māgaṇḍiya's critique of the Buddha as a buzzkill, I feel like a lot of people who have not really investigated Buddhism in that way kind of look at it as like, you guys just sit there in a room quietly not doing anything? Isn't that boring? Aren't you bored? Don't you want to go do something or see something or listen to something? So again, I feel like Māgaṇḍiya's critique of the Buddha is a lot of people's kind of feeling about Buddhism, that it's like, oh, you just don't want me to be having a good time. No, in that way. So I really like this sutra for the Buddha very clearly saying, I'm talking about pleasure. I'm just not talking about dependent pleasure in that way. So, any questions so far about any of the language that's been used? Any, this kind of conversation with Māgaṇḍiya so far? Everybody doing okay with? Because it just keeps getting better and better. Awesome. We're doing well on the schedule. One thing really quickly that we're going to want to pay attention to, and let me mention all of this right now. So the Buddha's sort of been talking about, or he's using three different ideas. He's talking about this idea of like, watching stuff, basically kind of like visual entertainment in that way, or any kind of visual stimuli. He's talking about, auditory stimuli that is pleasant, all of these different these different things. And he keeps mentioning that these sensual pleasures being provocative of raga. Now the text in kind of classic wisdom publication fashion, they keep translating raga as lust. It's warranted, it's possible, but I want to remind everybody that the way that I understand Buddhism is that these three poisons or these three root causes, one of them is raga. And raga, for me, it's just that initial stirring of wanting. It's like the opposite of it is like, ew, like aversion. I don't want that. But raga is kind of like a ooh, ooh. Then there's tanha. And tanha is like the craving. And my point is that you might see something or hear something or smell something or taste something or touch something that makes you go, ooh, and kind of is stimulating or attractive in a certain way. But craving, the thing doesn't even need to be around. In many ways, craving is the thing not being around and me and you wanting it in that way. So raga, this kind of stimulation or attraction, it can turn into craving. And then the Buddha adds the fever. I the sutra is going to kind of play on these ideas of tanha, which actually means thirsty. Like, so the word for craving is actually about kind of a thirsty craviness. So we're going to want to pay attention to raga, tanha, and I'm not quite sure about the Pali word for fever, and I don't want to give wrong information, so I'm just keeping it as the fever. So we're going to want to pay attention to that progression. Now, the Buddha hasn't really fully convinced Māgaṇḍiya yet. He's just gotten Māgaṇḍiya to recognize that peace of mind does not sound that bad. So when the Buddha says, hey, I've abandoned my craving for sensual pleasure and attained peace of mind, do you have anything to say to that? Māgaṇḍiya is like, yeah, no, what could I say to that? But now the Buddha, in classic Buddha fashion, is about to give us a series of analogies or a series of examples. Even before I get into these examples, I want to kind of put a warning, disclaimer. I want to remind everybody that these teachings are the old teachings from the more, monastic, celibate type of Buddhism. So I it's not that we're about to get a message of like monastic celibacy, but I want to remind you that the Buddha is talking to a group of monastic celibates. That's the important. So he's using analogies for them. So, sorry. So let's just put it this way, Māgaṇḍiya. Suppose a householder or a householder's son. So a householder or a householder's son, let's just say they were rich with great wealth and great property and being provided and endowed with those five cords of sensual pleasure, that wealthy householder or householder's son might enjoy himself with forms cognizable by the eyes, with sounds, odors, flavors, or tangibles cognizable by the body, which are wished for, desired, agreeable, and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of raga attraction. Having conducted himself well in body, speech, and mind upon the dissolution of the body upon dying after death, they might reappear in a happy destination. in the heavenly world, in the retinue of the gods of the 33 levels. And there, surrounded by a group of nymphs in the Nandanya grove, he would enjoy himself, provided and endowed with the 5 chords of divine sensual pleasure. And now suppose that person who got reborn in heaven saw a householder or a householder's son enjoying himself, provided and endowed with the 5 chords of human sensual pleasure. What do you think, Māgaṇḍiya? Would that young god, surrounded by the group of nymphs in the Nandana garden or grove, enjoying himself, provided and endowed with the 5 chords of divine sensual pleasure, would that young god envy the householder or the householder's son for their 5 chords of human sensual pleasure? Or would he even be enticed by human sensual pleasures? Māgaṇḍiya says, no, Master Gotama. And why? Because divine sensual pleasures are more excellent. They're more sublime than human sensual pleasures. And the Buddha says, so too, Māgaṇḍiya. Formerly, when I lived in the home life, I enjoyed myself. I was provided and endowed with the 5 chords of sensual pleasures, with visible forms cognizable with the eye, odors, sounds, odors, flavors, and tangibles cognizable to the body that are wished for, desired for, agreeable and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of lust. But on a later occasion, having understood as they actually are the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of sensual pleasures, I abandoned craving for sensual pleasures. I removed that fever for sensual pleasures, and I abide without thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. I see other beings who are not free from lust for sensual pleasures being devoured by their craving for sensual pleasures, burning with fever for sensual pleasures, indulging in sensual pleasures. And I don't envy them, nor do I delight in them or therein. And why is that? Because once again, Māgaṇḍiya, there's a delight apart from sensual pleasures, apart from unwholesome states, which surpasses even divine bliss. And since I take delight in that, I do not envy what is inferior, nor do I delight therein. Okay, second analogy or second example. Suppose, Māgaṇḍiya, there was a leper with sores and blisters on his limbs, being devoured by worms, scratching the scabs off the openings of his wounds with his nails. And suppose this leper were cauterizing his own body over a burning charcoal pit. Oh, but then his friends and his companions, his kinsmen and relatives, they would bring a physician, and the physician would treat him. The physician would make medicine for him, and by means of that medicine, the man would be cured of his leprosy. And the man would become well and happy, independent, master of himself, able to go wherever he likes. But then that leper who was cured, he might see another leper with sores and blisters on his limbs, being devoured by worms, scratching the scabs off the openings of his wounds with his nails, cauterizing his own body over a burning charcoal pit. What do you think, Māgaṇḍiya? Would that man envy that leper for his burning charcoal pit or his use of medicine? No, Master Gotama. And why is that? Because when there is sickness, there is need for medicine. And when there's no sickness, there's no need for medicine. Well, so too, Māgaṇḍiya. Formerly, when I lived the home life, I indulged in the five sensual pleasures, right? But now I abide without lust or thirst for those things, abiding with mind inwardly at peace. And there is this other pleasure apart from sensual pleasures. And since I take delight in that, I don't envy what's inferior, nor do I delight therein. And now this is the important third analogy for this. Okay, Māgaṇḍiya, suppose there was a leper, once again, with sores and blisters on his limbs, being devoured by worms, scratching the scabs off the openings of his wounds with his nails. And let's suppose that this leper was cauterizing his own body over a burning charcoal pit. But then his friends and companions, once again his kinsmen and relatives, bring a physician to treat him. The physician would make a medicine for him, and by means of that medicine, the man would be cured of his leprosy, and he would become well and happy, independent, master of himself, able to go wherever he likes. But then, two strong men would seize this guy by both arms and start dragging him towards a burning charcoal pit. What do you think, Māgaṇḍiya? Would that man twist his body this way and that, trying to get away? Yes, Master Gotama. And why is that? Because that fire is indeed painful to touch, hot, scorching. And now maybe the most important part of the sutra tonight. And what do you think, Māgaṇḍiya? Is it only now that the fire is painful to touch, hot and scorching? Or previously, was it also that the fire was painful to touch, hot and scorching? Māgaṇḍiya replies, Master Gotama, that fire, the charcoal pit, is now painful to touch, hot and scorching, and previously, too, that fire was painful to touch, hot and scorching. For when that man was a leper, with sores and blisters all over his limbs, being devoured by worms, scratching the scabs off the openings of his wounds with his nails, his faculties were impaired. Thus, though the fire was actually painful to touch, he acquired a mistaken perception of it as pleasant. So too, Māgaṇḍiya, in the past, sensual pleasures were painful to touch, hot and scorching. In the future, sensual pleasures will be painful to touch, hot and scorching. And right now, Māgaṇḍiya, the present sensual pleasures are painful to touch. They're hot, they're scorching. But these beings who are not free from lust for sensual pleasures, who are being devoured by craving for sensual pleasures, who burn with a fever for sensual pleasures, those people have faculties that are impaired. Thus, although sensual pleasures are actually painful to touch, they acquire a mistaken perception of them as pleasant. All right, let's pause there for just a moment. So that, I think, that's the message right there. I mean, there's more to come. There's kind of like reinforcing lessons to come. But that's really kind of the heart of the lesson right there. And by the way, a technical term that's being used here is either vipallasa in Pali or viparaya in Sanskrit. It's the term means inverted thinking. If you're familiar with the famous Heart Sutra, this is the upside down dreamlike thinking. That's what's being referenced here, is like the inverted thinking, mistaking pain for pleasure in that way. Really quickly, I want to mention just before we kind of move on to the next section, and I do think we'll have time to get all the way through this. I wanted to mention just as something I wanted to connect to from last week's Dharma Doors. So last week's Dharma Doors, we got around to talking about the cessation of this craving, of the fever, the cessation of it. And last week, I was making a comment about how, if there was something that you were maybe addicted to or had over craving for in that way, you could possibly stop doing it, but you still want to do it. But you have stopped doing it though, and so that is sort of relinquishment, that is abandonment, right? So that is upeksha in that way. But again, the idea is that somewhere deep down you would still like to do that. But then in the sutra that we read last week, Shariputra in particular kind of achieved direct realization and became an arhat. And that at that moment, the craving was done. And what we were talking about last week was that difference between stopping doing it, but you would still like to do it, versus not doing it because you don't want to do it anymore. And what I kind of want to clarify or tie together is that this analogy of the leper, and then that idea of like, what happens once the leper gets cured of his leprosy? And then some dudes come and grab him and start trying to drag him towards the charcoal pit. Wouldn't he like try to get away and like not want to go anywhere near the charcoal pit? Well, that's somebody who has truly abandoned that craving. Like, not only is it that they are not jumping in the charcoal pit, they don't want to jump in the charcoal pit. So I just wanted to connect that with last week's conversation about cessation. Oh, and by the way, I don't want to make it sound like that's easy. In fact, I want to remind everybody that it's the Buddha that doesn't want another drink. That's like what it means to be a Buddha, or maybe an arhat in that way. But my point is that to reach that level where you don't want to go in the charcoal pit anymore, that's being a Buddha. So if you're not there yet, please, it's okay, because that's like the ultimate goal here. So I just wanted to clarify that. If last week I made it sound as if it were that simple, this week I want to clarify that I do not think it is that simple. So, all right. Any questions about all? Oh, I did have one other thing I wanted to remind everybody of. Yeah, really quickly, just I wanted to point out that there's been a lot of conversation in here about the 5 chords of sensual pleasure or desire, not the 6 chords. And you would know that the 6th chord or whatever, but there isn't 6 chords. They don't even use that language of 6 chords. It's only 5. Seeing, so visual forms, hearing, smelling, excuse me, tasting and touching. Thinking, though, that's not one of the 5 chords in that way. And so I just wanted to kind of point that out in terms of this abandoning of sensual pleasures. So, all right. Everybody ready for the next analogy? Well, here we go. Suppose, Māgaṇḍiya, suppose there was a leper. Once again, we're going to go with the leper analogy. And suppose there was a leper with sores and blisters on his limbs, being devoured by worms, scratching the scabs off the openings of his wounds with his nails, cauterizing his own body, excuse me, over a charcoal pit. And the more the leper scratches the scab and the more he cauterizes his body, the fouler and more evil smelling and more infected the openings of his wounds would become. Yet, he would find a certain measure of satisfaction and enjoyment in scratching the openings of his wounds. So too, Māgaṇḍiya, beings who are not free from lust for sensual pleasures, who are being devoured by craving for sensual pleasures, who burn with fever for sensual pleasures, they still indulge in sensual pleasures. And the more such beings indulge in sensual pleasures, the more their craving for sensual pleasure increases, and the more they are burned by their fever for sensual pleasures. Yet they find a certain amount of satisfaction and enjoyment in dependence on the five chords of sensual pleasure. What do you think, Māgaṇḍiya? Have you ever seen or heard of a king or a king's minister enjoying himself, provided and endowed with the five chords of sensual pleasures, who, without abandoning craving for sensual pleasures, without removing that fever for sensual pleasures, have you ever seen a king or a king's minister who was able to abide free from thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace? Or who was able, or who will be able to so abide? Māgaṇḍiya says, no, Master Gotama. And the Buddha says, good, Māgaṇḍiya, I too have never seen or even heard about a king or a king's minister enjoying himself, provided and endowed with the five chords of sensual pleasure, who, without abandoning craving for sensual pleasures, without removing that fever for sensual pleasures, was able to abide free from thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace, or who is able or who will be able to so abide. On the contrary, Māgaṇḍiya, those recluses and Brahmins who have abided, or who abide, or who will abide free from tanha, free from thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace, all do so after having understood as they actually are the origin, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape in the case of sensual pleasures. And it's after abandoning craving for sensual pleasures and removing fever for sensual pleasures that they abided, that they abide, or that they will abide free from thirst, with a mind inwardly at peace. Then at that point, the Blessed One uttered an udanya, a ecstatic exclamation or a poem, saying the greatest of all gains is health. Nirvana is the greatest bliss. The Eightfold Path is the best of paths, for it leads safely to the deathless. All right. So this is sort of the end of some part of this. We're about to move to the next part, which is the concluding part. I just have one thing I really want to emphasize for everybody. I meant to emphasize it earlier, but never too late. I really, really, really want to emphasize that the Buddha keeps talking about craving sensual pleasures. So the problem is the craving. Visual forms and sounds and smells, they're just visible forms, sounds, and smells. They're not good, they're not bad, they're just are. So my point is that like I know I said earlier, I gave you the warning that, this is one of those old school sutras that really is promoting like celibacy and asceticism and monasticism. But the Dharma here is talking about craving. And that craving, that's freedom from craving can happen right here, right now, because it's just the craving in that way. Now, I'm the kind of Dharma teacher that will tell you that there are lifestyles and locations that are conducive to abandoning that craving. So there are certain environments that are conducive to that. Again, certain lifestyles that are conducive. But the key word there is that they are conducive to the job or the task at hand, which is the relinquishing of the craving in that way. I wanted to remind everybody, or just I wanted to give everybody a very like simple, simple example of this. It's an example I used to use a lot more because it's one that I deal with occasionally. And what it is it's the simple one regarding the craving or sometimes even the fever for certain flavors. And what I'm talking about is personally my deep desire for coffee in the morning. And oh my, if there's no coffee, you mean I have to drink tea? Ah, like, come on. My point is that in the morning, when there's no coffee there, there's plenty of tea, there's plenty of chai, there's plenty of you want a hot beverage? We got hot beverages for days. But I'm craving that which is not there. I would like coffee, but it's not there. That's what the Buddha's talking about. That craving where I might even get pissed off at my spouse. So now all of a sudden there's anger. You didn't buy the coffee. I really needed coffee this morning. So there can be this total, swelling up of anger and emotions and all of this stuff. And where's it coming from? Not the lack of coffee. It's coming from my craving for the coffee. Now, the reason why I want to use this example is because I'm talking about that morning when there's no coffee. But when I get up and there is coffee there, have coffee. It's there to be had. So I'm not the type of Buddhist in a way to espouse like asceticism, but I'm trying to get us to deal with the mind on those mornings when we're not getting what we want. So I just want to clarify that this is like, you could practice this all the time. It's happening all the time in that way. And so it doesn't just have to be the big stuff, sexuality or these things that Buddhism is often talking about. It can be something as simple as the flavor of coffee versus the flavor of black tea and my preference for one over the other. So, okay. Now, the real like oomph, the real impact of this sutra actually hasn't really happened yet. We've heard the Dharma. We've heard the Dharma teaching. And in a way, we've even heard defined what a Buddha is. A Buddha is one who has no craving in that way, no tanha, and therefore they abide with a mind at peace. That's a Buddha. The Dharma was already defined as that which brings about that cessation of craving. But we have an interesting little thing to deal with. So the Buddha, at the end of this, he recites this kind of famous udana, or this famous poem about that the greatest of all gains is health and nirvana is the greatest bliss. The Eightfold Path is the best of paths, for it leads to the deathless, to the Amrita, to the ambrosia. Now, when that was said, the wanderer Māgaṇḍiya said to the Buddha, the Blessed One, "Ooh, it is wonderful, Master Gotama. It's marvelous how well that has been expressed by Master Gotama. The greatest of all gains is health. Nirvana is the greatest bliss. Period." By the way, Māgaṇḍiya says, yeah, we too have heard earlier wanderers who were teachers and teachers of teachers saying this exact same thing about that health is the best thing, that nirvana is the best bliss. We've heard that before. And it agrees with what you're saying, Master Gotama. Ah, but the Buddha, he recognized something. And he said, but Māgaṇḍiya, when you heard earlier wanderers who were teachers and teachers of teachers saying this, what is that health? What is that nirvana? When this was said, the wanderer Māgaṇḍiya rubbed his limbs with his hands, and he said, "This is health. Master Gotama, this is that nirvana, for I am now healthy and happy, and nothing afflicts me." Ah, Māgaṇḍiya, suppose there was a man born blind who could not see dark and light forms, who could not see blue or yellow, red, or pink forms, who could not see what was even and uneven, who could not see the stars or the sun or the moon. Now, he might hear someone with good eyesight saying, "Good indeed, sirs, is a white cloth, beautiful, spotless, and clean." And then that blind person would go in search of a white cloth. And then a man would cheat him with a dirty, soiled garment, thus saying, "Good man, here is a white cloth for you. It's beautiful, spotless, and clean." And the blind person would accept it and put it on, and being satisfied with it, he would utter words of satisfaction thus, "Good indeed, sirs, is a white cloth, beautiful, spotless, and clean." What do you think, Māgaṇḍiya? When that man who was born blind accepted that dirty, soiled garment, put it on, and being satisfied with it, uttered words of satisfaction thus, "Good indeed, sirs, is a good white cloth, beautiful, spotless, and clean," did that blind person do so knowing and seeing, or out of faith in the man with good eyesight? Māgaṇḍiya says, "Venerable sir, he would have done so unknowing and unseeing, out of faith in the man with good eyesight." So too, Māgaṇḍiya, the wanderers of other sects are blind and visionless. They do not know health. They do not see nirvana, yet they utter the stanza thus, "The greatest of all gains is health, and nirvana is the greatest bliss." Yep, this stanza was uttered by earlier accomplished ones, fully enlightened ones. But it was uttered this way: the greatest of all gains is health, and nirvana is the greatest of bliss. The Eightfold Path is the best of paths, for it leads to safety, to the deathless. But unfortunately, nowadays, it has gradually become current among regular, ordinary people And although this body, Māgaṇḍiya, is a disease, a tumor, a dart, a calamity, and an affliction, referring to this body, you say that this is health, or you say that this is health, Master Gotama. This is that nirvana. You do not have that noble vision, Māgaṇḍiya, by means of which you might know what real health and real nirvana are. But Māgaṇḍiya says, but I have confidence in Master Gotama. I have confidence thus. Master Gotama is capable of teaching me the Dharma in such a way that I can come to know health and see nirvana. All right, Māgaṇḍiya, suppose there was a man born blind who could not see dark and light forms, not even the sun or the moon. And then his friends and companions, his kinsmen and relatives, they would bring a physician to treat him. And the physician would make a medicine for him. Yet by means of that medicine, the man's vision would not arise. It would not become purified. He wouldn't be able to see. What do you think, Māgaṇḍiya? Would that doctor reap weariness and disappointment as a result of that? Yeah, Master Gotama. So too, Māgaṇḍiya, if I were to teach you the Dharma thus, this is that health, this is that nirvana, you might not know real health. You might not know what real nirvana is. And that would be wearisome. That would be troublesome for me. So he's saying, if I told you and you didn't understand, I'd feel bad about that. But Māgaṇḍiya says, but I have confidence in Master Gotama thus. Master Gotama is capable of teaching me the Dharma in such a way that I can come to know health and see nirvana. Māgaṇḍiya, suppose there was a man born blind who could not see dark or light forms, not even the sun or the moon, and he might hear a man with good eyesight saying, "Good indeed, sirs, is a white cloth, beautiful, spotless, and clean." And the blind man, would go in search of a white cloth. And then a man would cheat him with a dirty, soiled garment, thus saying, "Good man, here's a white cloth for you, beautiful, spotless, and clean." And the blind man would accept it and put it on. But then his friends and his companions, his kinsmen and relatives, would bring a physician to treat him. And this physician would make a good medicine, emetics and purgatives, ointments and counter ointments and nasal treatments. And by means of that medicine, the man's vision would arise and be purified. Together with the arising of his vision, his desire and liking for that dirty, soiled garment would be abandoned. And then he might burn with indignation and enmity towards that man who sold him the soiled garment, and might think that he ought to be killed thus. "Indeed," the blind man, or who used to be blind, says, "Indeed, I've long been tricked and cheated and defrauded by this man with his dirty, soiled garment when he told me, 'Good man, here's a white cloth for you, beautiful, spotless, and clean.'" So just like that, Māgaṇḍiya, if I were to teach you the Dharma thus, this is that health, this is that nirvana, you might know real health and you might see real nirvana. And together with the arising of your vision, your desire and lust for the five aggregates affected by clinging might even be abandoned. And then perhaps you might think, "Oh, indeed, I've long been tricked, cheated, and defrauded by this mind. For when clinging, I've been clinging just to material form. I've been clinging just to sensations. I've been clinging just to perception. I've been clinging just to conditional habits. I've been clinging just to consciousness. With my clinging as a condition, being something comes to be. With being as a condition, birth comes to be. With birth as a condition, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair come to be. Such is the origin of this whole mass of suffering. So in other words, I might tell you, Māgaṇḍiya, and you might even get it, but then you're going to get mad and all pissed off that you've been deluded this whole time. But Māgaṇḍiya says, but I have confidence in Master Gotama thus. Master Gotama is capable of teaching me the Dharma in such a way that I might rise up from this seat, cured of my blindness. And this is the Buddha's answer. Then Māgaṇḍiya, associate with good people. Associate with good, true people. When you associate with good, true people, you will practice in accordance with the true Dharma. When you practice in accordance with the true Dharma, you will know and see for yourself thus. These 5 aggregates are a disease. They're tumors, darts. But here, these diseases, tumors, and darts cease without remainder. With the cessation of my clinging comes cessation of being anything. With the cessation of being anything, there is the cessation of birth. With the cessation of birth, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair cease. Such is the cessation of this entire mass of suffering. When this was said, the wanderer Māgaṇḍiya said, "Magnificent Master Gotama, magnificent Master Gotama. Master Gotama has made the Dharma clear in many ways, as though he were putting upright what had been put upside down, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, or holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see forms. I go to Master Gotama for refuge, and to the Dharma, and to the Sangha of bhikkhus. I would receive the going forth under Master Gotama. I would receive the full admission." And then we hear a little exchange that we've heard before in a few different sutras. This is where Māgaṇḍiya, who was one formerly belonging to another sect, the Buddha tells him, if somebody from another sect desires the going forth and the full admission into the Dharma and the discipline, they have to live on probation for 4 months. And at the end of those 4 months, if all the bhikkhus are satisfied with him, then they give him the going forth and the full admission to the bhikkhu state. But I recognize individual differences in this matter. And then Māgaṇḍiya says, "Venerable sir, if those who formerly belong to another sect and desire the going forth and the full admission in the Dharma and discipline live on probation for 4 months, and if at the end of the 4 months all the bhikkhus are satisfied and they give them the full admission to the bhikkhu state, well then heck, I'll live on probation for 4 years. And at the end of the 4 years, if the bhikkhus are satisfied with me, let them give me the going forth and the full admission to the bhikkhu state." And then the wanderer Māgaṇḍiya received the going forth under the Blessed One, and he received the full admission. And soon, not long after his full admission, dwelling alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and resolute, the Venerable Māgaṇḍiya, by realizing for himself with direct knowledge, here and now, entered upon and abiding in that supreme goal of the holy life, for the sake of which clansmen rightly go forth from the home life into homelessness. Māgaṇḍiya directly knew birth's been destroyed. The holy life's been lived. What had to be done has been done. There's no more coming into any state of being. And the Venerable Māgaṇḍiya became one of the Arahats. Hey, Māgaṇḍiya! All right. We made it all the way through. Amazing. Like, amazing. Questions, comments, answers, ideas, insights, epiphanies, realizations. Anything come up? There was a lot in there. Yeah, Noe.
I'm jumping back to the idea when you mentioned that he mentioned only the five and not the six, but then the six came in later. The six is the one that came in later on when the mind is there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So am I right about that?
You are right about that. What I really wanted to point out though was that at least early Buddhism, like certainly the type of Buddhism represented by these teachings, they really do sort of talk a lot about the five cords that bind us up, but there's a way in which the sixth organ, like it's what we need to get out of this. So there's a way in which we use that sixth cord. Again, it's not a cord, but we use that sixth faculty to get us out of this. And then even in this type of Buddhism, as Noe's pointing out, even that mind in a certain way is eventually put down in that, but in a way like you're kind of painting your way out of a room. You need that mind in order to think your way out for a little while. So at least in the early Buddhist tradition, they do it that way. So by the way, in case you didn't catch it, this sutra I don't know, I love this sutra. There's just so much going on in here. It's just full of Dharma. There's so many teachings in this, but I wanted to mention, so at the very beginning, when the Buddha is talking about there are those, who have the fever, who have the craving and all of that. And he says, and I'm just trying to find an example of it here. It's about when he's saying that those people, they don't understand the origin, the disappearance, the gratification, the danger, and the escape. So it keeps mentioning this idea that if you want to get your way out of this, you need to see and understand the origin and the disappearance and so on of all of these sensual pleasures. And I want you to know, or I want you to recognize that the Buddha then explained what that means when at the very end there, I don't know if you noticed what was going on, but in section 24, when he's talking about realizing, he's basically like, yeah, if I told you like what real health and real nirvana are, then you'd see it. And then you would think, oh man, long have I been tricked and cheated by this mind. And why? Because of this clinging. And because of this clinging, there's perception, and because of this perception, there's this. So the skandhas are active. And then, with my clinging as a condition, bhava, being, comes to be. And with being as a condition, birth comes to be. And with birth as a condition, aging and death. This is the teaching of pratitya samutpata, This is the teaching of dependent origination. There's whole sutras in here that are about this teaching, but this sutra just slides it in there. Like, oh, by the way, but what the reason why it's in here is because that's the origin of all of this. If you understand dependent origination, you will understand the origin. And it's about conditionality. So understanding dependent origination is about understanding conditionality. If clinging, then bhava. If, and you might have noticed that I was translating bhava as not just being, but the idea of being something. Like that's what bhava means, is like, it's not just this kind of like ontological idea of being, it's the ontological idea of like being something. And then what you will notice right away is that if there is something, there is the question of where that thing came from. In other words, it's birth. So there is an absolute dependency between the idea of bhava and the idea of birth. But also, you never, ever, ever have a death without a birth. If something was never born, it can never die. It's a package deal, as we might say. And that's about conditionality. And so when the Buddha's talking about if you get rid of that clinging, the upadana, if you get rid of that clinging idea, like attachment that I am a blank, if you get rid of the clinging, you get rid of the being something. Because you're not attached to that idea. You're not attached to the idea that this is a pencil. It appears as a pencil, but if you really think there's a being something here, the being of a pencil, then there will be the arising and the ceasing of that. So if there's clinging, there's being, and if there's being, there's birth and death. But if there's no clinging, conceptually or otherwise, then there's no thing there. And if there's no thing there, there's nothing to have been born. This is the teaching of birthlessness, by the way, that the Mahayana is more interested in, is the idea of something never having been born. But if something's never been born, it can't die. And that's called the deathless. The Amrita, otherwise in Greek ambrosia. And that's what the Buddha's poem was originally referenced. Remember the 4-line poem. The 4-line poem said that the Eightfold Path is the best of paths, for it leads to safety and the deathless. So I kind of wanted you to notice how a bunch of ideas get explained at the end. The idea of the origin, the cessation or disappearance, the idea of the deathless, like all of these ideas get resolved at the end of the sutra. So yeah. I mean, you even have the metaphor of the blind person, and it's like now I can see. It doesn't get any more kind of religious than the whole I was once blind, but now I can see thing. So Maria.
Yeah, it seems like this is another one of these like Mahayana Easter eggs.
Mm.
So like if there's no craving, there's no being, like as in there's no beings, um, in the Bodhisattva sense. Um, so it seems like a hint at that as well.
In terms of the Vajra Sutra sense, no sentient beings, no self,
Yep.
individuality, sentience or life.
Yeah, and if there's no being, if there's no beings, then there's no birth.
Exactly.
So
Yeah. Speaking of kind of Mahayana Easter eggs in that way, I did mean to mention sort of at the very beginning, but I can just mention at the end here, I am often quoting from a Mahayana sutra called the Shurangama Sutra, and it's one of my favorite quotes. And what it is the Buddha says, ordinary people are turned around by objects, but a Tathagata, the Buddha, turns objects around. That quote like just sticks with me as like that's it. It's either you're kind of being triggered by everything and everything is sort of just you're basically like a puppet where reality's just pushing in and you're like, okay, I'll like that. Okay, I'll be afraid of that. Okay, I'll do this. So that's being turned around by objects. That's burning with the fever and the craving. But the Buddha says, or you could be like a Tathagata and turn objects around. In other words, not be turned around by them in that way. And so that kind of message that I'm always quoting from the Mahayana tradition, this sutra is entirely about not being turned around by objects. In the language that's used to define I love the language actually that the Buddha uses when he's talking about the leper who no longer he's been cured of the illness, and that language of that he's independent, free to go wherever he wants. That's the message for me of this, of independence versus being actually bound by the cords of desire, not free, enslaved in that sense to objects and things in that way. So that's the message of the sutra. I also love the message about, have you ever seen a king or a king's minister with peace of mind? Something to definitely think about in our day and age in that way. So, all right, everybody. I think that's going to do it for another Dharma Doors. Excellent. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for coming. Always a pleasure.